The end of a trilogy. Again. For the third time. The story picks up with Kylo Ren in hot pursuit of the apparently returned Emperor Palpatine. Finn and Poe are out gathering intelligence about the First Order, who appear to be gathering another attack, and Rey has almost completed her Jedi training with deepfake General Leia. And then some Star Wars stuff happens. Sorry about being so vague, but I'm going to cover as much as possible here without any spoilers at all, being really careful. And then I'll talk about some really spoilery stuff with a very clear warning. The Rise of Skywalker has a tough act to follow in The Last Jedi, a film which was surprisingly inventive, extremely divisive within fandom, and provided a lot of left-field plot developments. The main strategy in this film is to ignore or reverse as many of those as possible, to the point that it feels panicked at times. You can almost imagine the Disney execs freaking out over negative Twitter threads and YouTube videos decrying The Last Jedi for actually trying something different, no matter how dumb it was, and it was quite dumb. And then they decide the only way to deal with this is to make sure that it's as safe as possible, even if that means a bland, dull film that leans way too much on nostalgia. Don't want to spook the fans. Let's make it dumb and familiar. It's the movie equivalent of chicken tendies and honey mustard. It doesn't help that the film struggles under the weight of its fan service, which infests the movie like a cancerous growth. If you thought The Force Awakens was bad, you ain't seen nothing yet. At times it feels like 50% of the film's dialogue is calling back to previous lines, which make up, of course, the other 50% of the dialogue. There's references to old characters, old films, even old lines. It makes the world of the films feel smaller, despite the scope of the adventure, and they do visit about 8 planets in this, which makes space travel seem like taking a bus to the shops. The overall feeling is the execs and the filmmakers feel like the audience are pigs, happy to pull a lever or press a button and receive the same treat each time. It's artificial and it's boring, and you can't shake the feeling that you're watching a LARPer reenactment of a better film. And it drowns out the very few good original ideas that the movie has. A chase sequence that takes place during a rare and jolly religious festival is quite a good idea if you ask me, so of course they drop it and go somewhere else before the action starts. The other stalwart of Disney's homogenous slop is character banter, a kind of dialogue that has the rhythm and timing of comedy without being funny. There's plenty of it here, and it's completely at odds with the tone of Star Wars as a whole. The closest thing to this in the original films is Han Solo's snarky conversations with Leia and Luke. That works because they don't indulge in it too much. Leia is annoyed and Luke is too earnest, so it's comedy, but it's comedy that comes from the characters and the contrast between them. Here, tragic news is tempered by characters literally asking for it to be delivered in a more positive, upbeat way. Hard to know if that's actual dialogue or a script note that made it in by accident. Underneath these little problems, the film is empty, hollow at its core. It's heartless. Characters act strangely because it would make for interesting set pieces, and it means nothing feels like it's consequential. Abilities and power sets expand when the plot demands, meaning that there's no real risk at any point. Oh yeah, I should say, the one thing they decided to keep from The Last Jedi was the space wizard stuff. Plenty of space wizard mumbo jumbo here. Because it has no fundamental direction, the movie takes a number of staggeringly stupid missteps in its late stages, so completely questionable that the man next to me in the screening just repeatedly swore under his breath. Old ideas are recycled unconvincingly, the finale's explosive fireworks are damp squibs, and we're left with a climactic film that fails utterly as an ending to its trilogy, the wider sequence of films as a whole, or even as a coherent story in and of itself. Sound good? Okay, I'm going to get into some spoiler territory now, so if you want to avoid that, stop watching the video now. Spoilers begin. Let's talk about character arcs in the film. Firstly, Rey, the nominal protagonist of the series. If you recall, one of the more interesting elements of The Last Jedi was its decision that Rey's parents were nobodies. A powerful choice that makes her feel distinct from the swathes of prophesied chosen ones that you get in films all the time. Nope. Forget about that. Rey is actually a somebody, as we're told by Palpatine in the first few moments. This opening scene really does its best to roll back as much as possible of the previous film. Turns out the Emperor cloned Snoke. He actually has a big jar of Snokes floating around like pickles in brine. Turns out that he was the baddie all along throughout all the rest of the film, so forget the great throne room sequence of The Last Jedi. Here's something comfortable and boring. But Rey isn't just a somebody, she's somebody important, because there's apparently no other way way of doing twists in the Star Wars universe. She's Palpatine's granddaughter. This is one of those moments where the man next to me swore. This is so intensely stupid, I actually have no idea what they were thinking of when they did it. It doesn't even seem to make basic sense. Did Palpatine have a son in the prequel trilogy? I don't remember that. That seems relevant, right? And important, especially as this son apparently rebelled against him. Palpatine turns into the wrinkly guy we all know and love in Revenge of the Sith. I'm assuming that he's not having kids after that. Sorry, Palpatine. That's 20 years before A New Hope, 50 years before The Force Awakens. So for this to work, he definitely had that son during the prequel films. And yet, shock horror, we learned nothing about this in any of those movies. It's terrible, terrible writing. If you, like a lot of people, felt like The Last Jedi played too loose with canon, then this should appall you. And worst of all, it's not really necessary to the plot. Rey confronts Palpatine and eventually destroys him with the help of Kylo Ren. That's all that needs to happen. She can be tempted by the dark side, turn good, and win without being a blood relative of someone in the old movies. With that stupidity in mind, let's turn to the other main character, Kylo Ren. Ben Solo. He looked like he would get a redemptive arc in The Force Awakens, only for Rian Johnson to turn that on its head and make it into a downward spiral arc instead. Fair game, interesting. Except here he's good again. Why he's turned isn't exactly clear. In a confrontation with Rey trying to convince her to rule the Empire with him, he's distracted by a telepathic message from his mum, and Rey almost kills him. She then uses her space magic, let's call it what it is, come on, to heal him, a surprising new power that would have been quite useful at various points throughout the 8 previous films in this series. After this, he's suddenly good. Yippee! Oh, and Leia died, not sure why, she looked fine before, a little deep-fakey but relatively healthy. So Kylo does get his redemptive arc after all, and he even gets to kiss Rey for reasons. How else do you end a movie? A nice big smooch. And speaking of smooching, Poe and Finn basically have very little to do in the film. They spend the runtime following Rey, shooting things and quipping while flying around very fast, and their characters don't really change. Except, do you remember all the fans who were shipping them together? You know, could this be the first big LGBT romance in a major franchise? Nope! Forget about that. Disney has to sell movies in Russia where even mentioning homosexuality can mean jail time. And of course, China isn't exactly big on it either. You can't just cast and defend an actor who's against the Hong Kong protests. You have to make sure audiences are on side as well. Which is why we should never expect big corporations to take strides in LGBT representation on the screen, as much as we might dearly wish that that was the case. No, Poe and Finn are shacked up with other characters who they barely know, who we have no idea who they are really. Rose, Finn's sort of love interest from The Last Jedi, is relegated into a background role because, hey, gotta do whatever the audiences think they want, right? Better get the chicken tendies and honey mussy ready. Almost done talking about all the stupid stuff, so here's a quick fire round of other things in the movie that make no sense. Are you ready? General Hux turns out to be a spy against the First Order, which makes no sense, absolutely no sense, no matter how much you look at it. Rey finds the Wayfinder by using a dagger that looks ancient, but appears to have been made just 20-ish years ago. Lucky that none of the debris this method uses as a reference point has shifted in all that time, despite the massive waves, and lucky that she's standing in exactly the right spot for the dagger to work. A woman threatens to kill Poe Dameron and tries to capture Rey, then immediately after offers him a very valuable way off planet and invites him with her, literally minutes after it all takes place. I don't know. The First Order, now called the Final Order, as if it's closing time at the pub, has gotten a comically large fleet that they somehow put together. Every ship in this stupid fleet has a planet-destroying weapon on it because JJ Abrams hates new ideas and the audience is terrified of change. Rey chucks her lightsaber into a fire and Luke's Force Ghost is in the fire and then he just catches it, which is just the most stupid image. Kylo turning good means he's suddenly able to make jokes. A gigantic amount of civilian ships arrive to help the rebels, apparently without anyone noticing until they were literally in the atmosphere, and despite First Order blockades on hyperlanes across the galaxy. How do they get there? And last but not least, the Force can now heal wounds, teleport objects across interstellar distances, and Force lightning can disable a whole fleet of ships. You know, of all the things they could have kept from The Last Jedi, I just wouldn't have put money on the space wizard stuff being what they did, you know? So there you have it. Disney has a near monopoly on major releases and uses that apparent dominance to justify its films and fandom wars. People say stuff in defense of them like, "See, Martin Scorsese? Everyone loves the MCU because they all watch it," which of course ignores the fact that a Disney film is often the only option for most cinema goers. In this world where Disney has as much money as they could ever need, could make anything they want and it would sell, they make the most soulless, incredibly bland, meaningless films, which are precision designed to satisfy an algorithmically determined audience. No artistic worth, all the evocative cinematography, lush music, and production design couldn't save this film from being artistically and emotionally bankrupt. And the worst thing is that people are convinced that they ought to defend these movies. It's awful, and I have no time for it, and you shouldn't either. So don't forget to like and subscribe, watch my other videos, tell your friends, and have a rad day, my fellow gamers. Can we get this to 25k likes?